The flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. was packed with business people, vacationers, and a few people traveling to visit family. Among the passengers, seated comfortably in first class, was Sergeant Major David Thompson, a black man in his mid-50s. He sat with the quiet dignity that came with years of experience, both on and off the battlefield. The scars on his body were a testament to his years of service in the military, and his calm presence radiated a sense of quiet strength. David had earned the right to sit in first class, not just through his hard work and sacrifices, but through his service to his country. After spending decades in the Army, rising through the ranks, and enduring multiple tours in some of the most dangerous parts of the world, a first-class seat was a small reward for the life he had lived. As the plane began its ascent, David settled into his seat, pulling out a book and preparing to relax for the next few hours. The soft murmur of the cabin around him was comforting. He had flown countless times before, but there was something about being in first class that made the whole experience feel different. The luxury, the space, the service. It was a brief moment of peace, a reprieve from the relentless pace of life. But just as he was beginning to settle in, a voice interrupted the quiet hum of the cabin. "Excuse me," a man's voice said from the aisle, sounding slightly irritated. "I believe you're sitting in my seat." David looked up to see a well-dressed white man in his late 40s standing beside him, his expression one of entitlement. The man had already glanced at the seat number and now looked down at David with a sense of impatience, as though he expected David to immediately move. David blinked, taking a moment to assess the situation. He had seen people like this before, people who seemed to believe that rules didn't apply to them, especially when it came to people like him. "No, sir," David replied, his voice steady. "This is my seat. I've been assigned to it." The man's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the seat number, then back at David. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "This seat is meant for people who can afford it, not, well, people like you." David's grip tightened slightly on the armrest, but his expression remained calm. He had been through far worse in his life than a moment like this, but that didn't mean it wasn't frustrating. The man, however, wasn't done. "I'm sorry," the man continued, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "But I've got an important meeting to get to, and I'm not about to sit in coach. You can move to the back where you belong." The cabin fell silent for a moment, the tension between them palpable. David didn't react immediately. Instead, he looked around the cabin, noticing the uneasy glances of the other passengers. They were watching, waiting for a response. Finally, David stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. He was aware of the eyes on him, of the judgment, the assumptions, the racism that lingered in the air. But he wasn't about to let that define him. Instead, he turned to face the man fully. "Let me tell you something," David said, his voice low but firm. "I've earned this seat. I've earned the right to sit in first class, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let someone like you tell me I don't belong here. You see, I've fought for this country. I've fought for the freedom that allows you to speak to me like this. I've seen things you couldn't even imagine, and I've sacrificed more than you could ever understand." The man stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, unsure how to respond. The other passengers had begun to listen, their attention shifting toward David as his words echoed through the cabin. "I didn't serve this country for people like you to disrespect me," David continued, his eyes now locked with the man's. "I served so that you and everyone else could have the right to sit where you want, to speak your mind, and to be treated with dignity. But that doesn't mean you can treat people like me as less than. You don't get to dictate my place in this world." David paused, letting the words sink in. The entire cabin was still, and he could feel the weight of every eye on him. But this wasn't just about a seat, it was about respect. "And let me make it clear," David said, his voice rising with strength. "I'll sit wherever the hell I want. And if you don't like it, I suggest you take your complaint to someone who cares." The cabin was silent, the tension between David and the entitled passenger palpable. Everyone was waiting for the next move. Would the situation escalate, or would it diffuse? For a long moment, the man who had challenged David remained speechless, clearly unsure of how to respond. His face was flushed with embarrassment, but there was something else, something deeper, beneath the surface. Fear. David stood tall, his presence unwavering. The flight attendant, who had been observing the interaction from a distance, walked over cautiously, clearly sensing the unease in the air. She stopped beside the man who had spoken to David. "Is there a problem here, sir?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, glancing between David and the man. The entitled passenger's eyes darted between the attendant and David, his posture now stiff. I just thought he was sitting in my seat," he stammered. His voice lacked the confidence it had held moments earlier. The flight attendant looked at him, then turned her gaze to David, who stood quietly, not backing down, but remaining composed. "I see," she said slowly. "Sir, as you can see, this is Mr. Thompson's seat. It's assigned to him. I'm afraid you'll have to return to your designated seat." The man's face tightened with frustration, but he made no move to argue. The flight attendant was gentle but firm in her approach, and David's unwavering demeanor seemed to remind the man of the reality he was facing. This was not a battle he would win. The man looked away, muttering something under his breath, but didn't say anything else. He turned and shuffled back to his seat in the middle of the cabin, his movements stiff with irritation and perhaps a growing sense of guilt. As he walked past the other passengers, many of whom had witnessed the interaction, their eyes followed him, some filled with judgment, others with admiration. The room had shifted. The energy in the cabin was different now. David had commanded respect, not through anger or violence, but with quiet dignity and strength. The flight attendant turned back to David, offering a warm, sincere smile. "Thank you for your patience, sir. We'll make sure this never happens again." David nodded, his expression softening. "I appreciate it," he replied simply, his tone no longer as sharp but still filled with authority. He returned to his seat, sitting back down and taking a deep breath. For a moment, the storm of emotions that had been building in him began to subside. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some with expressions of support, others still processing what had just transpired. A young woman, seated across the aisle from David, couldn't help but speak up. "Sir, I just want to say thank you," she said, her voice hesitant but filled with gratitude. "I was really uncomfortable with how that man was speaking to you. You handled that with so much dignity." David turned toward her and smiled softly, his expression warm. "Thank you," he said kindly. "It's not always easy, but sometimes you have to stand your ground." The woman nodded, her eyes filled with respect. "It was a lesson in courage for me, too," she admitted. "I don't know if I could have done what you did." David's gaze softened. "We all have the ability to stand up when it matters. Sometimes it's not about fighting. It's about showing who you are, and that you're not afraid to be who you are." The woman smiled back, clearly moved by his words. The rest of the flight passed in relative peace, but the atmosphere had changed. David felt a quiet sense of pride in knowing that, even in a simple moment, he had made a statement, not just for himself but for everyone on the plane. He had taught them all that dignity and respect weren't just for those who fit in, they were for everyone. As the plane continued its journey toward Washington, D.C., the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained charged with the ripple effects of the confrontation. The passengers, once nervously avoiding eye contact, were now more engaged. Some exchanged glances, while others subtly nodded in David's direction, their expressions filled with quiet admiration. It was clear that the moment had left an impression on everyone who had witnessed it. David leaned back in his seat, his eyes briefly closing as he allowed himself to relax. The conversation with the flight attendant had settled the matter, but the lingering frustration still buzzed in the back of his mind. He didn't mind standing up for himself. He had been doing it his entire life. But it wasn't always easy, especially when the challenge came from someone so entrenched in their sense of entitlement. The woman who had spoken to him earlier, who had offered her gratitude, caught his eye again as she walked down the aisle heading toward the restroom. She paused as she reached his seat. "I just wanted to say again how much I respect what you did," she said, her voice earnest. "You really stood up for yourself and for all of us. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about something bigger, wasn't it?" David looked up at her, his gaze thoughtful. "It's always about something bigger," he replied with a calm nod. "It's about dignity. It's about not letting people define you by their prejudices or assumptions." The woman smiled, her eyes reflecting the weight of his words. "That's a lesson I won't forget," she said. "I hope I can be as brave as you when it counts." David gave a slight smile in return, a modest acknowledgement of her words. "You're braver than you think. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to stand firm, even when the world tells you to sit down." She nodded thoughtfully before continuing down the aisle. The encounter, while brief, was a powerful one, not just for the woman but for everyone who had witnessed it. David's actions had reminded them all that true courage wasn't about fighting back with force. It was about holding your ground with integrity and respect. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., the mood in the cabin shifted again, this time to a more contemplative tone. The earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by a collective reflection on what had happened. David was just one man, but his example had shown the passengers that standing up for yourself didn't require violence, anger, or even a grand speech. It just required the courage to be who you were. As they landed and the seatbelt sign illuminated, David gathered his belongings slowly, taking a final moment to reflect. He had done what he always did. He had stood tall in the face of adversity. And he knew that, for those who had watched, the lesson was clear. Never allow anyone to diminish your worth. Stand proud in the face of ignorance, and always remember that respect is something that must be demanded, not given freely. When the plane had come to a full stop and passengers began to deboard, David remained in his seat for a moment longer, allowing the flow of passengers to move ahead. He wasn't in a rush. The fight, after all, had already been won. As he stood and made his way toward the exit, he passed the same woman who had spoken to him earlier. This time she gave him a knowing smile and a slight nod. "You were right," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "It's about dignity. Thank you for showing us how it's done." David nodded in return, a small smile playing on his lips. We all have to stand up for what's right whenever we can, and sometimes that's all it takes. As David stepped off the plane and made his way toward the terminal, he could feel the subtle shift in the air around him. It was as if the events of the flight hadn't just affected him, they had reverberated through the entire cabin, leaving a lasting impact on everyone who had witnessed it. Passengers who had initially seemed hesitant to engage now exchanged glances with a newfound respect. It wasn't the kind of respect that could be easily earned. It had to be shown through actions, and David had done just that. When he reached the baggage claim area, David felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find the young woman from earlier standing behind him, a look of determination in her eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice steady, "I just wanted to thank you one last time. After what happened on the plane, I realized I've been letting people walk all over me for too long. I've never stood up for myself the way you did. But after seeing you, I think it's time I start." David smiled warmly, pleased to see the change in her. "You've got more courage than you realize," he said. "It's all about taking that first step. Once you do, you'll find that standing your ground becomes easier every time." The young woman nodded. "You're right. It's not about just standing up for yourself. It's about standing up for everyone who doesn't have a voice. I'm going to make sure I speak out more, whether it's at work, in my community, or anywhere." David could see that her words were genuine. She wasn't just going through the motions. She had internalized the lesson. He could see that the ripple effect of his actions on the plane had already begun to spread. The woman thanked him once more and walked off toward the exit, but David's thoughts didn't stay with her for long. As he continued through the airport, he realized that this moment, this small act of standing up for himself, had opened something bigger. He hadn't just taught one person a lesson. He had reminded everyone who was listening that respect wasn't optional. It was a fundamental right. The rest of the day passed quickly. When David arrived at his hotel, he turned on the news, eager to hear the latest headlines. What he didn't expect was to see a brief story about the flight incident. A viral video from the plane had made its rounds on social media, and people were talking. They were talking about him. The video showed David's calm, powerful confrontation with the entitled passenger, followed by the flight attendant's apology. In a matter of hours, it had reached thousands of people, and the comments were overwhelmingly supportive. People praised David for his dignity, his courage, and his ability to stand tall in the face of racism and injustice. David couldn't help but smile as he scrolled through the comments. Many were from people who had faced similar struggles, who had felt marginalized and invisible. They saw in David not just a man who had confronted an arrogant passenger, but a symbol of quiet strength, a reminder that they too had the power to demand respect and equality. By the time David sat down for his dinner that evening, he had received several messages from fellow veterans, friends, and even strangers, all expressing their gratitude for his example. It was clear that his actions had created a ripple effect, one that would go far beyond the confines of that plane. As he sat back in his chair, David reflected on the journey of his life. He had fought for this country, served with honor, and earned his place in the world. But today, it wasn't his uniform or his rank that had earned him respect. It was his humanity, his courage, and his unyielding commitment to stand up for what was right. And in that quiet moment of reflection, David knew that sometimes the most powerful lessons in life came not from battles fought on the front lines, but from the quiet, steadfast moments when a person refused to back down.